Hi, everybody. It's your friend, or at least your parasocial friend to some of you, Dwayne Monroe, and I'm here today with Dr. Robert Bashara. Um, Robert, how would you describe yourself? I'm inclined to describe you as a theorist of in the psychoanalytic tradition, but perhaps
hmm
that is inaccurate.
Yeah, it's a good
Yeah,
question. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to this dialogue. I'm
yeah.
excited and looking forward to it. My background is in the fine arts. Many people don't know that, but
Hmm.
before getting a PhD in psychology, I studied theater, music, and film. And, I spent a long time doing that stuff before getting more into the academic side of things. So there's that piece, and then in terms of like the psychology piece, I identify as a critical psychologist, which means that um, pretty much I challenge mainstream psychological notions from a critical perspective,
Mhm.
which for me is either psychoanalytic or decolonial, basically.
Yes, and indeed, the your Twitter handle is decolonial psych,
Exactly.
actually, which is fantastic because
Right.
when I first started, I don't even recall how we started conversing, but you probably posted something that I thought was intriguing, or maybe it was through.
Was it probably Vanessa? That's my
Oh,
guess.
maybe, yeah. You know
Yeah.
what? Yes, I think it
She
was.
connects a lot of people. Vanessa Sinclair, shout
Yeah.
out, Rendering Unconscious podcast.
Absolutely, absolutely. Awesome, awesome podcast, by the way. It was a pleasure to be on that show. And then also I saw that, you also, I think, were communicating with Isabel Millar and other
Right.
people, and just really fine people who are just doing excellent work. But what intrigues me about what you do, is that, as you say, you're applying these methods, psychoanalytic methods, and perhaps psychology to some extent as well, to urgent questions that confront us, such as colonialism.
Right.
Yeah, so keep digging, brother.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things, because we had a conversation before this meeting about the question of ideology and ideology critique. And
Yeah.
I thought that it's a relevant one to kind of unpack and also to see if we can apply it to a recent example, such as the anti-CRT, anti-critical
Hmm.
theory discourse.
Hmm.
So obviously, the notion of ideology, many people trace it back to Marx and Engels and their understanding of it as the ruling ideas of the ruling class,
Hmm.
and basically that it's dialectically related to the material base of any given society, relations of
Hmm.
productions, all of
Yes.
that. And so it's not something to be dismissed because given that it's dialectical, um, we have to think of the relationship between ideology and materiality. And that's why I like the concept of apparatus.
Hmm.
For me, it links those two notions together because sometimes when we talk about ideology only, we forget about materiality and how it's connected to ideology, right? And so I think of racial capitalism
Mm.
as an apparatus that is very much tied to colonialism. The history of
Hmm.
colonization, particularly the colonization of the Americas, right,
Hmm.
in 1492. So that's like a starting point for a lot of my analyses,
Hmm.
because pretty much that event, and we can call it event in that philosophical sense,
Hmm.
changed the world. Like the world that we live in today is very much an outcome from that event. And so
How would you distinguish, um, capitalism aside, or perhaps capitalism is the heart of the distinction, but how would you distinguish, if you would, the colonialism of the capitalist era from the colonialism, say, of the ancient world? Because we know that the
right.
ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, others, of course, created colonies
Yeah,
and spread their modes of life to conquered places.
that's a great question, and I always think about it. And sometimes scholars try to distinguish the two in terms of conquest versus colonization.
Hmm.
Obviously, there was we can say pre-modern colonization. from the decolonial scholars, like such as Enrique Dussel,
Mm.
they trace 1492 as kind of the beginning of modernity, and that's kind
Yeah.
of a contentious statement because obviously different scholars will locate modernity at different points in time. But
Hmm.
his point is that that's the beginning of the modern world system that we live in today, wherein before that, obviously there were different contestations of power,
Mm.
but the so-called discovery in the New World allowed for this hegemony of Europe, these European empires, and by extension the U.S. and
Hmm.
Australia, as
Hmm.
settler colonial societies, and their establishment as powerful empires, not just politically but also economically. So um, before that event, we don't have we have kind of shifts in power that
Mm.
happen, but nothing that is established at this level and in this systematic way,
Yeah.
particularly in terms of genocide and enslavement. I mean,
Yes.
the transatlantic slave trade, I think, is cited as the most significant movement, forced movement of large number of people. There's nothing before that
Yeah.
event at that
Yeah.
level, right? So that
Yes.
makes it, the magnitude
Yes.
of that, and how it established a system, a world system that we still living in today. So before that, there were different contestations of world systems that kept shifting, right?
Hmm.
But the world that we live in today is an effect of 1492.
Yeah, and you could say that, for example, there would be a Roman Empire and a Persian Empire, and they contended on the field
Exactly.
of battle. However, between them, there were different ways of life. Whereas today, although there is the People's Republic of China and the United States, both fall under the umbrella of global capitalism. So there's an
Absolutely.
ideological commonality there that did not exist in the ancient world.
Absolutely. And the big thing too, I think this is important because again, the question of where we locate capitalism, do we connect it with industrialization in the United
Mm.
Kingdom? Racial capitalism for me as an apparatus, but also as a concept, captures the accumulation that takes place, under colonization, and that is allowed by enslavement, because you wouldn't be able to
Mhm.
accumulate capital the way these empires did without colonization and enslavement, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So we can just talk about industrialization um, without talking about this accumulation, which is sometimes called as primitive accumulation, kind of
Hmm.
a problematic term.
Yeah.
But that's why it's important to think about this accumulation um, that was possible because of pretty much forced labor on a mass scale that
Hmm.
eventually leads to industrialization for that to be
Hmm.
possible in Europe, right? And
Hmm.
so that's why we have to think of racial capitalism as basically capitalism has always been racial, has always
Hmm.
been uh, essentially racist, right?
Yes.
And that's a key component for it. We can't just look at class struggle and labor relations without analyzing this racializing and racist dimension of the capitalist apparatus.
As a scholar of psychoanalysis and also of colonialism, among other things, to what extent do you think that the racialization can be um, uh, explained by Christianity? In other words, the Romans, and I return to them because they provide an example of a mass of a large scale civilization that was based upon slavery,
Right.
much larger than the ancient Greeks, right?
Hmm.
Um, and although I'm sure that humans being humans, that there was degradation in terms of people looking down upon, but without the Christian frame of, but we're supposed to be, we're supposed to be children under God, and
Right.
without the scientific language to try to explain these alleged differences using pseudoscientific terms, um, it seemed more, at least from what we have of the ancient record, it seemed a bit more direct. Like if I'm Marcus Agrippa and I conquer Thrace and I have Thracian slaves, I'm going to mistreat them because I'm a bastard, and also this is
Hmm.
my understanding of the world. But I may not think that they are inherently inferior to me. They are
Right.
simply conquered.
No, that's a really good question, and actually, I write about this in my first book, Decolonial Psychoanalysis.
Hmm.
It has to do with the genealogy of racism, right?
Hmm.
So racism started out as religious racism. I mean,
Hmm.
speaking of modernity again, we can talk about the xenophobia that you referred to before modernity,
Hmm.
which was obviously there,
Yes.
ethnic differences and all that. But
Yeah.
what we have with the establishment of modernity, Christianity as a religion becomes a racial marker. And
Hmm.
so, again, 1492 is an important event because not only do you have the colonization of the Americas, but before that, you have the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Spain,
Hmm.
right? So, and basically, Christianity was not just seen as a religion, but it had to do with blood purity. So, if you're
Hmm.
not Christian, you don't have purity of blood,
Interesting.
and basically, the Muslim and Jews had an option either to leave or to convert.
Or to convert. Yes.
Yeah, and so uh, when I looked at, because my first book is on Islamophobia, and I wanted to understand the Islamophobic fantasy, because a lot of scholars were thinking about Islamophobia only as a reaction to the war on terror and 9/11. But I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to look at the genealogy of Islamophobia as a fantasy, and I actually went back to the 15th century to look at this displacement that takes place from the Spanish conquistadors, where
Mm.
the kind of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism that they had, in relation to Muslims and Jews in Spain, was projected onto Native Americans.
Mm.
And this is actually in their documents. I looked at the letters that the Spanish conquistadors, were writing, and they actually referred to this. The way they were actually looking at Native Americans
Mm.
was through the lens of the other as Muslim and Jewish,
That's
because that was
fascinating.
their frame of reference.
Exactly. That was
So
the
you can
language they
say,
had available to them.
right.
Yes.
So you can see already the beginning of religious racism and its actually basis in anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and how it gets basically projected onto any kind of other.
It's
You know,
astounding. It's astounding to think that Hernan Cortez, for example, might have thought of Aztecs as Mohammedans, as they might have said, right? He was
absolutely
like, what are you even talking about? This civilization is
right.
completely different,
But
right?
they weren't able to understand them on their own terms, so they
Yes.
just looked at them on the basis of what they already understood, which wasn't good anyways, because they
Yes,
didn't actually.
precisely.
So,
Precisely.
but that's the basis of religious racism. Now, of course, over time, you have the development of what's called scientific racism, where you
Mm.
have evolutionary theory, social
Mhm.
Darwinism, especially in the 19th century, being used to somehow explain differences between humans and why some group of people are more intelligent or superior, etc. And the kind of racism that we have today combines those two together under what's
Mm.
called cultural racism. So basically, cultural markers end up being markers of difference, and they
It
become the basis for racialization.
it's fascinating that you say this to me because when my wife and I moved to Europe, um, and I had noted this tendency from longer visits, but moving here it became very clear. When we moved to Europe, what I noted was that when I would talk to people, particularly in Northern Europe and in France, um, well, I'm marked as American, yeah,
Right.
and so people say, well, you're darker skinned, and so yeah, but people are for somehow they're always able to recognize the U.S. in
Hmm.
you for the most part, and even if they have any doubt, the moment you open your mouth, it's all doubt
Right.
is removed, and so I have noted different treatment, and this was particularly true in Belgium,
Hmm.
where a white Belgian person turned to me and said in disgust about the immigrants who were coming from the Arab world.
Right.
Now he's talking to me, a black person, but
Right.
in his mind,
You're
I
an
was marked
American
as
that
what?
would agree
A
with him.
Christian and a
Right.
Christian.
Right.
And I was marked as a Christian in his
Right.
mind, right? And so so whatever color prejudices he may have harbored
Right.
in that moment, those were subsumed under this what he presumed was cultural affinity because we
Right.
both we both knew the stories
So that's
and
of
so forth.
course
So
the civilizational myth, right?
yeah,
That you know we might be different, but we're both civilized, and they're very different
yes,
because they're barbarians and they're
exactly.
primitives,
This
right?
is what I have detected, and it really astounded me because I'm like, because coming from the U.S., I wasn't accustomed. It's just people have
Right.
crazy racist ideas, and typically there's no nuance. It's like, you could be the black guy or the non-white person who invented the machine that saved the Earth from an asteroid, but you're still a dirty whatever to
Right.
to a person whose mind has been completely poisoned by
Right.
racist ideology. And as you know, there's gradations of that. It's not all insanity,
But yeah,
but
your
yeah,
point about the importance of religion and racism, as I mentioned in the beginning, is religious racism. The
yeah,
theologians back then, the arguments they were having, the Spanish theologians were, well, do Native Americans have a soul? Are they human? Like these
yes,
are
yes.
theological arguments that they were having because they want to determine how are we going to treat them? Are we going to treat
Do,
them
do
as
you
beasts?
recall do you recall the name of the priest who accompanied Cortez? Because I
I
have
don't
read some of his
remember. Yeah,
letters.
I don't remember the
Yeah,
exact name,
yeah.
but I remember the theological arguments that they were
Yes,
having.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
So yeah, and so to go back to the question of ideology, because I think it's such an important
Hmm.
concept if we are committed to ideology critique. Um, so the Marxist notion gets revised later on by Lacan and Zizek, uh, and what they inject into it is the question of fantasy, which I think
Hmm.
is so central, particularly in Zizek's work, but it's also
Hmm.
there in Lacan. And so
Hmm.
what I show in my first book, Decolonial Psychoanalysis, which deals with the relationship between the war on terror discourse on the one
Hmm.
hand and the Islamophobia, Islamophilia fantasy on the other hand, and how
Hmm.
the two are connected. Because
Hmm.
before that book, scholars were always suggesting that there is a connection, but that connection was not theorized. So
Hmm.
what I attempted to do in the book is to theorize the connection. Of course, the connection is ideology.
Yes.
So the war on terror discourse is sustained by the Islamophobia, Islamophilia fantasy. And
Hmm.
this relationship is what I call ideology. And
Hmm.
so Lacan's notion of the discourse of the master or the master's discourse, which I think I shared with you,
Yes.
we can show it to the
Yep. We
audience
can
if you
bring
like.
that up. Yes.
So in seminar 17, the other side of psychoanalysis, Lacan talks about four discourses that are important for humans. They're not the only
Hmm.
discourses out there in the world, but they are. He highlights them as important discourses for us, that we shift between them and that they position us in different ways. The most popular one, and it's connected to what we were talking about, racial capitalism as an
Hmm.
apparatus, it's related to colonization, racism, all that, is the discourse of the master. And so let me break it down so we know what we're looking at. So obviously, Lacan loved using mathemes, these
Yes.
mathematical symbols, and he
Yes.
did that not to kind of be overcomplicated. In fact, his intention was to formalize psychoanalysis so that regardless of cultural or linguistic differences, we
Hmm.
would look at these mathemes and we all know what they mean.
Yes.
So, let me break it down. So there are four elements, as you can see from the bottom left. That's the barred subject,
Hmm.
the subject of psychoanalysis, in other words, the subject who is divided between consciousness and the unconscious, or the
Hmm.
ego and the unconscious,
Hmm.
divided by language, divided by law, divided by entering into the symbolic order, etc., etc. And then above that, and for that location, he calls the truth of that discourse. So the
Hmm.
truth of that discourse is that barred subject. On top of that, you have S1 or master signifier, and these are basically any kind of signifiers that are used without the need to explain them, and
Hmm.
usually they function in a very ideological way. So I like to use in the US example freedom and democracy as signifiers that are repeated ad nauseum,
Yes.
and you don't have to actually like analyze them or break them down. You just have to repeat them,
You
and
just say them. Yes.
yeah, and you keep saying them, and they actually have an ideological function, right?
Hmm.
They create a certain response. And then S2 signifies knowledge. So basically, the
Hmm.
idea that you need to begin any signifying chain with this master signifier, and then you're going to create a series of signifiers on the basis of that. And
Hmm.
that's how you have discourse, right? So the discourse of
Interesting.
freedom or the discourse of democracy will
Hmm.
be generated this way. So that top
Hmm.
part, you can see there's an arrow going from the left to the right,
Yes.
and this signifies that The master signifier is the agent speaking to the other as knowledge, but it's a unidirectional relationship. It's
Mhm.
not bidirectional, which means that there's miscommunication. So you're being
Mhm.
spoken to, but you don't get a chance to respond, right?
Yeah.
And that's a lot of how, if you think about it, how discourses function. You're just exposed to them in culture or in society, and you don't even get a chance to really respond to them. And they just recreate themselves or repeat themselves, and that's how they function
And would it be fair to
ideologically.
say that if you were to challenge some of these foundational concepts, that it causes disruption? Like if someone says, "Well, it's for my freedom," and then you say, if you were to ask a simple question, "What is freedom?"
Yes,
That act itself would be considered disruptive.
absolutely. And that
Hmm.
act itself is the hysterical act.
Hmm.
So if you were to imagine the barred subject being in the position of the S1, and we
Hmm.
just move everything clockwise,
Hmm.
the barred subject would be questioning the S1. So
Hmm.
that's what you were referring to. And in that
Hmm.
case, that would be the discourse of the hysteric. And as you know, in psychoanalysis, it was the hysteric that invented psychoanalysis, not Freud,
Hmm.
by
Hmm.
questioning what Freud was doing. So this
Hmm.
idea of questioning or being critical, I know hysteria has like negative connotations because of
Yes.
historical reasons, but for psychoanalysis, it's a position that's related to questioning and being critical. So it's actually very positive, and it's the position that actually produces critical knowledge, such as Marxism or
Hmm.
psychoanalysis itself, right?
Hmm.
So as kind of discourses that challenge master discourses or
Hmm.
ideologies in general, and then
In my field, the word innovation, for example, I think fulfills that role. It
that's one,
falls right within freedom, democracy, and so forth, because it is wielded as a kind of master, in a way, because you simply can shut people up by saying, "Don't if you do X, you will prevent us from innovating," and
right,
then the idea is that you're shutting down discourse at that point.
right. So whenever you hear like any kind of discourse where certain words are repeated without any criticality, and you know that you're
Mm-hmm.
dealing with a master's discourse. And that's why I located the war on terror discourse there,
Mm-hmm.
because that's a discourse where you don't have to actually uh, really think about what's going on. You know
Yeah.
that it's a racist discourse that is meant to frame Muslims as terrorists, and
Mhm,
so that was
mhm,
what I tried to show in the analysis, but also go further by looking at fantasy.
mhm,
Okay, so bottom right, you have the A, which is the product. In this case of this discourse, is referred to as the object cause of desire, the objet
mhm,
petit a, or sometimes as surplus enjoyment.
mhm,
And so this discourse is generating this A. Now, if you notice at the bottom, there is no relation between the BART subject and the A.
mhm.
So I told you at the top there's miscommunication, which
Yes.
is fundamental in psychoanalysis. That when we talk to each other, because by function of having egos, two egos communicating, they're going to be miscommunicating
Mhm,
because they're going to be imagining what the other is saying and
mhm,
ultimately talking in different directions in a sense. What psychoanalysis is interested in is not in that miscommunication, but what's happening at the level of the unconscious, right?
mhm,
So the things that we can't really control, right? The slips, the jokes, the
mhm.
parapraxes, such as Bush recently saying, in reference to Ukraine,
Yes.
referencing Iraq, hence pretty much owning up to what he did, but at the same
Yes.
time distancing himself through the audience laughter, and
Yes.
everyone is in on it, and so
Mhm,
everyone accepts the discourse of the master, and he's a good
mhm,
example of a master there.
mhm,
Um, so the relationship between the bar subject and the A is basically because there's no direct relationship. It's
mhm,
characterized by fantasy.
mhm,
And usually, what Lacan uses to symbolize the fantasy relationship is a lozenge, which signifies four kinds of relationship: uh,
mhm,
larger than, greater than, less than, or more than, less than. Like four kinds of arrows, basically, that you would get
mhm.
combined.
Yeah.
Um, so, basically, for me, the discourse of the master in my book Decolonial Psychoanalysis, I use it as a template for ideology critique.
Mhm.
If we want to understand how ideology works, especially not just from a Marxist perspective, but also from a Lacanian one, we
Mhm.
have to bring in the discourse of the master to see how any discourse, such as this one, that discourse that goes from S1 to S2,
Mhm.
is supported by this fantasy, that relationship between the bar subject in relation to the object cause of desire.
Mhm.
So this sounds very abstract, and that's why I want to make it more concrete by analyzing the anti-critical race theory
Yeah.
discourse.
Yeah, please do.
So we can locate the anti-CRT discourse at the top,
Mhm.
right? And basically, what the people using this discourse as a master discourse do, they're basically saying that there's a connection between critical theory and critical
Mhm.
race theory.
Mhm.
That's the ultimate thesis that they,
Mhm.
and it's a very that, and it's not a very sophisticated thesis because all they did is just connect words.
Yes,
They
that's
just see that
precisely
there's
all they've
critical
done.
theory,
Yes.
arrow, critical race theory, therefore they must be connected, right?
Yes, precisely.
And the whole conspiracy is based on this. Now, of course, at the bottom of these signifiers, you have the Barth subject, which we can think of as white, Christian, conservative, capitalist, male, heteronormative, etc.
Mhm.
So this is the kind of subject that's having anxiety about these discourses of critical race theory and critical theory, which are
Mhm.
hysterical discourses, right?
Mhm.
We can refer to incels in this category as well because they're
Mhm.
connected to this world. But basically, you know, the Barth subject by default is castrated, has lack, but they can deal with that.
Mhm.
So, one of the things you learn from psychoanalysis is how to accept that and deal with it as opposed to denying it or pretending it's not there. So it's that lack is constitutive. So they're not the only lacking subjects in the world. Their problem is loss of relevance,
Mhm.
right? And
And
therefore,
I think they're actually quite explicit about this, in after a fashion, if you listen carefully.
so what I'm claiming here is that this anti-CRT discourse, how it's functioning ideologically, is functions in a fascist way
Mm.
because the fantasy beneath that discourse is the great replacement fantasy.
Yes.
So let's analyze this further. So the way fantasy functions psychoanalytically, it has two functions. So basically, a fantasy is like a screen. And
Mhm.
the word screen is beautiful here because it captures the two meanings of screen. Screen, on the one hand, that conceals.
Mhm.
So this fantasy is concealing something, and what's it's concealing is desire. So it's blocking, right? A screen that's
Mhm.
blocking. But also, it is a screen, as in a movie screen, onto which you project things, right? So it's also
Mhm.
revealing desire. So, and fantasy does that in a contradictory way, and its logic follows the logic of the dream.
Mhm.
So, Freud defined a dream as wish fulfillment. However, the wish is always disguised; it is distorted. So that's why we need interpretation. Well, that's why we need psychoanalysis to
Yes.
understand. Well, what is really the wish at work here, right?
Mhm.
And so the desire at work is actually the desire for great replacement.
Mhm.
So, these subjects will claim that they're being replaced by these racialized others, but what they're actually desiring is their replacement.
Yeah.
And that's how the fascist functioning of this ideology. And of course, this whole thing about banning CRT is meant to basically cover up uh, the actual history of the Great Replacement, which is the
Yes.
genocide of Native Americans,
Yes.
right? The enslavement of African peoples,
Yes.
and the racism toward immigrants from the global South, right? So that's how the fantasy is functioning here to support. And of course, at the A, on the A, I put what I would call the conceptual woke. So
Mhm.
because they always refer to the other side as woke, right?
Mhm.
And it's an interesting term because if the other side is woke, then that means they're asleep. And then it would actually support my point that they're dreaming of this fantasy and they're having
Mhm.
this desire.
Mhm.
The nightmare scenario, of course, is that they're sleepwalking too, because I mean,
Mhm.
the Buffalo shooting is an example of that, right? Of not only fantasizing but actually living this fantasy
Yes.
in the most violent way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So on the conceptual woke, and conceptual here is meant to capture the fact this woke ideological fantasy figure, this object A, which is the object that's causing them anxiety. This object is kind of an amalgam of many things. On the one hand, you can say it's non-white people in general, but
Mhm.
it's specifically Jewish people and Black people.
Yes.
And the reason why I'm saying that, because of the connection between critical theory, Frankfurt School,
Yes.
German Jewish immigrants that are
Yes.
escaping Nazism, and of course critical race theory, which mostly theorized by Black scholars.
Yes.
But in addition to those two figures, who are the figures of the racist hatred here, there's also radicals in general, communists,
Mhm.
socialists, anarchists, and all
Mhm.
those are combined together as the woke, right? So that's the
Mhm.
conceptual woke, the kind of work it's doing there in this fantasy, right? Now, of course, the S2 from this anti-CRT discourse is this whole conspiracy of cultural or race Marxism. And
Mhm.
to say that it's knowledge is to say, of course, that it's the kind of ideological knowledge that is meant to drive fascists to, to believe in this ideology and to act upon this ideology,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? So that's the danger at work here, that this ideology is masking or covering up the traumatic real of colonization,
Yes.
genocide, slavery, racism. That's how it's working.
This is interesting.
So I'm going to
Yeah.
add a couple of points that are kind of mind blowing. So if you notice, I said the anti-CRT discourse is sustained by this great replacement fantasy.
Mhm.
Notice the signifier great.
Mhm.
And again, think about make America great again.
Mhm.
This fantasy about a return to greatness.
Mhm.
What is this return to greatness, right? So obviously, any fascist ideology is also based on a nationalist fantasy about sameness. So this greatness is a greatness where, we're all the same and we don't have difference. We don't have the
Yes.
other.
No visual difference, no ideological difference, not even differences in necessarily in the way that we appoint our homes.
So the basically from this perspective, the point of fantasy, or the point of ideology, is to cover up the antagonism and the contradictions and impossibility of the real.
Mm.
So the real in this case, as I mentioned, I named it as the real of colonization, the real of genocide, the
Mhm.
real of slavery, the real of racism. The question
Mhm.
is, how will society deal with that? Is it gonna cover it up ideologically through a discourse like anti-CRT and
Mhm.
banning CRT from public schools, or is it gonna actually face it directly and deal with it, knowing that it's impossible, but still, um, our responsibility, if we are, interested in the potential of human beings in terms of humanization and
Mhm.
liberation and all of that, would be that we would have to work through that trauma
Yes.
as opposed to covering it up. And of course, the funny thing about what they're doing, why, is that, obviously it's a master's discourse. These are masters. They're just anxious about the fact that they're losing relevance.
Mhm.
They're anxious about their castration,
Yes.
and they're pretending to be victims. They're pretending to be hysterical. So they're
Mhm.
masters who are pretending to be oppressed, who are pretending to
Mhm.
be right. But of course, what I tried to show is ultimately their fantasy about great replacement. What it does is showing their desire for this great replacement,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
It's interesting. So, but and when you say that they are behaving as if they are hysterics, their narrative, their arguments, are positioned as if they are the ones who are disrupting an order. Like they are revolutionaries in a sense, right? And I think to my study of the history of the Third Reich, in which the Nazis saw themselves, regardless of how we see them as reactionaries, but they saw themselves as a positive, forward-moving revolutionary force, powered by this sort of gyre of fantasy, and bringing in more, creating more and more destructive activities, to kind of feed that fantasy, which is how I've come to think of that period, which we appear to be re-entering, or we never left it, but it seems to have regained new force. I think as the problems of capitalism become more acute, and also as we face
Right.
some existential threats such as climate change. Um,
Absolutely.
and I wonder what you think about this, because this makes absolute sense to me. Strange as it may seem, but your explanation is actually quite brilliant. I
Thank
think
you.
though
And this is the
that I
first time I present this announced, so I did it for your podcast
oh, this is fantastic.
as a
Thank you.
gift. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, because when people hear about Lacanian thought, I mean, especially I remember someone watched some of Lacan's videos, one of the seminars that he did that was recorded, that's
Yeah.
available on YouTube. And of course, as Zizek, I think, points out, much of what Lacan did during some of those seminars was performative.
Yeah.
And a person said to me, well, it's just, someone said to me that it was post postmodernism. I said, well, it's not postmodernism
No, no, it's not.
at all. But that label was used because it was
I would say
difficult.
it's surreal,
Yes.
because that's his what he was influenced by growing up. So he grew up with the surrealists in France, being influenced by and being friends with people like Picasso and
Mm,
Dali,
mm,
and so that was his milieu. That was the world, and he published some stuff in their journal and their magazine, The Minotaur. So he was very much associated with the surrealists.
mhm,
But I want to add a couple of things based on what you said. So they're definitely masters pretending to be hysterics, but they're not hysterics, because the whole point of hysteria is to question master signifiers.
mm,
And, critical race theory and critical theory are not master signifiers, because what they
mhm,
are, they're questioning master signifiers like capitalism and
mhm,
how it functions ideologically. So
mhm.
we just have to be realistic and actually look at what is the dominant ideology, or what is the dominant world system, and who is the one that's being critical of it here, and who's the one that's sustaining it. So you can see that the fascist ideology that I analyzed here is very much
Mm,
structural and has a function within ritual capitalism. But I want to
yes.
add the position from which to critique hysterics, because that's a possibility also within psychoanalysis, is the position of the
Mhm,
analyst. So again, if you go back to the master's discourse that I shared,
mhm,
um, if we move the barred S in the position of S1, that would be the discourse of the hysteric.
mhm,
Now move it one more time, and you get the A in the position of agent. That would be the
mhm,
analyst as a
mhm,
object cause of desire, kind of um, causing the desire of the end, the hysteric who's doing the
mhm,
analysis. And what the challenge is about producing new master signifiers,
mhm,
because the old ones don't work anymore.
mhm.
So in a sense, the analyst is the one that challenges the hysteric. It's not the master. So you see what I'm saying? It's
Yes.
not. It's
Would you
not gonna.
say would you say that the approach that Zizek took to Peterson during what people call a debate, but which I interpreted as a therapy session in a way, right? Would you say that that was the approach that Zizek took? Because it did seem as if, rather than engaging in a debate or anything
Yeah,
like that, that he was actually that he
that's a
was
good
doing, I think,
question.
what you're describing.
Yeah, I would say that in that debate, in quotes, Peterson was in the position of the master,
Mm,
and Zizek was the hysteric that's
mm, mm,
hystericizing the master.
mm, mhm,
But the analyst is a different position, because it involves less speaking and more listening.
mm, mhm.
So that's why I wouldn't locate Zizek there, because he does overspeak,
Yeah.
right? So he wouldn't be a good analyst, in other words.
Yes. True. It's very
Yeah.
true. I this sparks lots of thoughts within me, because we face a number of challenges that require us to be very clear-headed. And yet the realm of fantasy is preventing us in a variety of ways from moving forward. So for
Hmm.
example, resistance to climate change, or rather to the reality of climate change, often comes from a position, I think, of fantasy, right? That, sometimes that fantasy takes the form of people believing that there will be a technological fix that will just Deus ex
Right.
machina come. Sometimes it comes from like sheer denial,
Right.
and there are other forms, and there's also, of course, the ongoing reality of the fact that we have atomic weapons,
Yeah.
right? And they haven't gone anywhere, and they can be used. And the invasion of Ukraine and the rhetoric that arose because of that event, Putin being quite, whether he's bluffing or not, but being quite upfront with saying, for the first time in decades,
Yeah.
I'm willing to incinerate you. Um, uh, that sort of thing, and not just him alone. Obviously, I'm sure the U.S. has made
Yeah.
similar statements. So, but these things are quite heavy, right?
Yeah.
And for those of us who just want to, you know, watch some TV or take care of our kids or have a glass of wine, it is a lot. The immensity of the problems seems to me, kind of compels us to retreat into fantasy, or at least
Yeah.
the incentives to retreat into fantasy are quite powerful. And I wonder how.
It's
um,
structural because
Yeah,
it's we perceive reality through fantasy. I mean,
yeah,
that's because we have an unconscious and we have desires, and those desires are disappointed,
yes,
and we are fantasizing about a sense of mastery or a sense of enjoyment, and
yes.
so there's no way to get rid of that. And actually, I think what you're pointing to is the crisis of the left,
Hmm.
because you were talking about the resistance to climate change,
Hmm.
and so actually that's something that Lacan, uh, addressed in the wake of the May '68 movement.
Hmm.
Uh, when the students were challenging him, and I think the video that you watched on YouTube is an example of that. The student that interrupts his
Yes,
lecture, right?
yes, yes.
And so that's a good example of a hysterical subject, having an intervention. But the
Hmm.
question that Lacan raises is like, well, what do you want?
Yes.
And he said, well, what you ultimately want are new masters. And that's very
Hmm.
disturbing because,
Hmm.
again, if you think about how analysis works, the hysteric produces new master signifiers,
Hmm.
which means that those new master signifiers are going to be the new master discourse.
Yes.
And that's the problem of any revolution in human history, is
Hmm.
that literally you have these elements that are in the discourse just shifting and moving around all the time, and they end up reproducing, obviously, different kinds of ideologies, but the structure
Hmm.
is still the same. You still have a
Hmm.
master discourse sustained by a fantasy, and it seems like, and that's kind of, when I was ending the book Decolonial Psychoanalysis, because I went
Hmm.
through all the four discourses
Hmm.
and they cycle back. And so even if we challenge the war on terror discourse, and even if we challenge anti-CRT discourse, what we're going to produce are new discourses that eventually could become master discourses.
Yes.
And so the challenge never stops, and in a
Yes.
way that's beautiful, because that speaks to the human spirit, is that it's not stagnant,
Yes.
but it also speaks to the structural effect of language and desire, and how it's in a sense a never-ending process.
You mentioned a little while ago crisis of the left, and I wonder if one of the crises, of the left is an unwillingness to accept the fact that there is a need for a new but less destructive master discourse.
Yes. And there's a need to face up to the fact that any new master discourse that we come up with as a left, whether it's socialism or what have
Hmm.
you, is always going to have fantasy elements,
Yes.
which means it's going to have othering, which
Hmm.
means is going to have a dark component that we have to face up to.
Yes.
And that has to do with the way the real functions, is that the
Yeah.
real cannot be represented. The violence of the real. When you think about genocide and enslavement, we can talk about it, but do we really capture that experience
Hmm.
and how horrible it is? I don't think we
Hmm.
can.
Yeah.
And this is ultimately what we have to deal with. Like any emancipatory discourses, especially when they become in the position of mastery,
Hmm.
where they're there to supposedly solve problems in society,
Hmm.
are gonna
Hmm.
face this impossible real, which cannot be represented in a symbolic way,
Hmm.
and they're going to revert back to using fantasy to cover it up, because that's what fantasy does. It kind of plugs in the ideology and hides any inconsistency that's there, right? And the
Hmm.
impossible real, because of how traumatic it is, doesn't fit perfectly within the ideology. It
Yes.
shows that it's not coherent, it doesn't
Yes.
really work, it has inconsistency. And ultimately, we have to work with that. And that's
Yes.
really difficult. That's really
Now,
difficult to do.
if you have time, let's actually play with these concepts a little bit, and let me bring your diagram back on screen. So, as you may know, my project is to take my years of experience in as a technologist and to use that to resist the propaganda of the tech industry.
Yes.
So as you no doubt know, you know, materialism. In other words, that that there are the computers are machines. They are in data centers. They consume power. It's not magic. And what I'm starting to think is that this approach is absolutely necessary, but insufficient. Because to take, for example, the story about artificial intelligence, the master narrative now coming from Google and those types of entities is that we are producing thinking machines. Now, this is false from a material perspective, but resisting this idea or trying to replace this idea with the reality of and the materiality of machines that do not think, um, I think is unsuccessful because there's clearly a need for a fantasy. Now, my thought is that the replacement fantasy would be a new master narrative would be, or master discourse would be that computation should be used cybernetically, for example, to create like a new kind of society, and that would be the story that would replace the false story of
Right.
innovation and Silicon Valley as this land of geniuses and so forth.
Right.
Um, where do you think? And now that's an incomplete thought, obviously, and it requires more development.
Yeah.
But now that I have you,
Well, it's interesting. You talked about great replacement, and we were just talking about a second ago. And it's
yeah,
interesting that in the AI discourse, there's this, especially, the best place to see ideology is like movies and stuff like that, right?
hmm.
Like the great replacement fantasy there is that the AI will replace humans, the machines
Yes,
will replace
precisely,
humans, right?
precisely.
So the question we have to raise about that: what is the desire that is concealed by that?
Hmm.
So that's the
Hmm.
analysis here would be to what is this? What is the desire that is concealed by this fantasy?
Hmm.
Well, that's what we have to kind of
Yeah,
ask and try to answer.
yeah, yeah. And I don't. I mean, I don't, certainly don't have enough information. I don't think at this stage to be able to answer that question or even hazard a guess. Although I do think that part of it, and this is just a not even half baked thought, but it's simply just something that pops into my head, is that the partisans, I mean, when you factor out capitalist incentives to actually just fool people into giving you money by saying that you invented something you haven't invented, but amongst true believers, as opposed to hucksters, although sometimes they can be the same, amongst true believers, I have a sense that there's a need for rescue,
Yeah.
that that they understand that the world is in grave danger, and there's a need, there is a desire for rescue, and because they don't have the tools that some of us have, at least with some grasp of, say, materialist or Marxist concepts. At least we have some idea of how you might grapple with these things, whether we're successful or not. But at least we're not entirely trapped within capitalist fantasy.
Right.
Um, but lacking that, I think that this is a response, just as I believe it was Zizek who once said that Nazism was a tragic response to a real problem.
Yeah.
And
And
then I
that's
think we
what
can
I
see
was
that.
trying to say is that the
Yeah,
real antagonisms of society are based on
yeah,
these real historical problems,
yeah.
that continue to inform what we're doing today, right? And that's why
Hmm.
that's the legacy of 1492, in other words.
Yes. Yeah.
But I would add also, because of, Zizek says this, and he got it from Frederick Jameson.
Mm.
The idea that we can imagine the end of the world, but we cannot
Mm.
imagine the end of capitalism. I think is
Yes.
very relevant here because all these dystopian films about AI, it's all about the end of the world, but it's not about the end of capitalism. So in
That's
a
correct.
sense, you can
Yeah.
see that the AI or the machine functions as a ideological fantasy figure, a boogeyman.
Mm.
In a sense, the way I talked about how the racialized other functions.
Mm.
So it was maybe that's how it's used phantasmatically, is that we need to have an enemy
Hmm.
in order to have this, in other words, fake struggle,
Mm.
as opposed to deal with the actual contradictions that are generated by capitalism.
Yeah. Yeah. And that might be the role that this particular fantasy is one of the roles it's fulfilling. And I think it also fulfills the role of allowing some people to appoint themselves as saviors. I mean, Musk's entire
Right,
uh, complex is built around the idea that he is somehow working to save humanity from this AI that's going to destroy us, or from the destruction of the
right.
of the habitat by moving people to Mars. Neither of which is possible, but that's how he's presenting. He's presenting
But
himself
it works
as their
ideologically,
master.
and that's the whole point, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And look at him, like he's in the position of S1, and he's like the typical, stereotypical, actually,
yes,
uh, master, the
yes.
white, male,
Mm,
rich, right?
mm.
So like, how surprising,
Mm.
right?
I know, it's so shocking, right?
Right,
Oh my God, yeah. But I love how that allows us, like these various examples, allow us to take this Lacanian formulation and actually ground it in a way that I think would help people
my
to
point is to
understand.
show people that it's not scary, because I know when
Yes,
you show those symbols, especially people who have math anxiety would look
yes,
at this and be like, oh my god. But I tried to break it down in such a way to show that actually this is a really helpful tool for
yes.
analyzing how ideology works, and how ideology, the real, when we talk about the real of colonization, genocide, etc.,
Hmm.
that whole legacy
Hmm.
of 1492, that's the
Hmm.
materiality.
Yes.
That's the material contradictions,
Yeah.
that are in society. That's what informs class struggle, racism,
Hmm.
sexism, all kinds of oppression. So
Hmm.
this is the stuff that we have to face directly, and as opposed to like go around it. And
Hmm.
whether we're leftist or not,
Yes.
we're going to be faced with the same problem.
Precisely.
This
Yes.
is, so I talked about the conservative way of dealing with this is creating this fascist ideology and using anti-CRT discourse that way. But we know from example Stalinism. I mean, Zizek writes about this too. Worked, even though it's on the left,
Mm.
it functioned in a, even though it's not fascist per se, but it's authoritarian and
Yes.
totalitarian,
Yes.
and it functioned ideologically in a different way, but it still functioned ideologically, right?
Yes. Yes.
Um, so Zizek is good there. He makes a distinction between fascism on the right and totalitarianism on the left.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
we still have this problem of authoritarianism, whether left or right,
Yes.
which is a political problem, right? Because socialism is an economic question, but then there's the political question of authoritarianism, right?
Hmm.
And so we just have to be more nuanced and complex in our analyses, and there's no end to critique, right?
Yeah. As long as as long as there's life, right? So,
Right.
only, as the ancient Greeks said, I think only the dead are satisfied, or count. Was it count no man fortunate until he's dead. So
Right.
we're not done
So the
with
political
critique.
questions that are, I talk about this in Freud and Said from a Lacanian perspective, are major political question. First of all, we have to resist politics that are based on imaginary identification. These are
Mm.
very seductive politics where there's a
Hmm.
charismatic leader and we
Hmm.
feel like we're identified with this leader.
Mm.
These politics exist on the left in terms of populism, but also
Yes.
obviously in fascist right politics.
Yes.
The charismatic leader and in identifying with that leader. That's very problematic, honestly, for the left and the right. What we have to
Yes.
think about, the question of, well, what do we desire as a collective? Do we
Mhm.
have any common desires? That's number
Mhm.
one. So that's a political question. What is it that we
Mhm.
want in a society? Obviously, we're going to get different answers, but in order to have solidarity or a coalition, we'll have to have some kind of list of answers that we can agree on. So that's
Mhm.
the first question. And then the second question related to that first question is, what do we enjoy together?
Mhm.
And we can think about the commons
Mhm.
here as a good example of that, right?
Mhm.
All the things, the public goods that we would enjoy. And those are, for me, like the two fundamental political questions. What do we
Mhm.
desire collectively? What do we enjoy collectively?
It's very
Right?
basic. Just very
Very
basic.
basic,
Yes.
but they end up not being asked because
Mhm.
we get we always fall into the trap of imaginary politics,
Yes.
because a charismatic leader appears
Mhm.
on the left or the right, and we think that the solution is with this person.
Yes.
But that person is a human being with faults, and
Yeah.
they're gonna die, right?
Right.
But
Even
we need
even if they're
to
fantastic, yes,
yeah, we need
they
to build a
yeah.
movement that lives, that outlives
Yes.
us,
Yeah.
right? A movement for our kids, for the next
Yeah.
generations.
It's interesting that I'm happy that you bring this up, and we can use this as a closer, because I was actually going to ask um, about your thoughts regarding how to apply these tools, these ways of thinking, to political action. And you actually answered the question.
As questions, right? Because we don't want to have a politics of answers.
Yes.
We want a politics based on these questions, and we generate the answers together, and the answers are going to be revised as we move along, right?
Yeah. And that also would be a dialectical approach as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
So
embracing complexity, as you mentioned, I think before we recorded, you were talking about the complexity at work in Formula One.
yes,
And what if we applied this complexity to
yes,
other social problems? And that's
yes,
exactly the point. Is complexity means that I don't have the solution. I have certain questions. We can come together, ask those questions
mhm,
together, and think about what are the best solutions, right? Collectively, because we put our
yes.
minds together, we put our efforts together, we do it dialectically as
And this would be an
comrades.
exciting. I think this would be. I mean, committee meetings and all these things, of course, are inherently boring. But I think that this method of this way of engaging with political questions, even if it's do we need a new sewer line in the town, would keep people engaged, and also would minimize the danger of falling into various types of errors, some of which are quite terrible. Because if you have a collective understanding and also a collective way of engaging people. Like, for example, we know that one of the methods that the Amazon labor union used was like doing barbecues.
Exactly.
Not hectoring people about how evil Bezos is. Like,
Right.
here's a burger.
Absolutely. So these techniques, these practices need to be shared and replicated, especially if they work.
Yeah. Well, Robert, thank you very much for this.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
And also for this fantastic introduction and overview to this element of Lacanian thought. Um, at some point in the future, I think I'd like to have another conversation, a recorded
Sure.
conversation with you, because there are congruences between what I'm working towards and what you are doing and what others in your field are doing. Because as I've mentioned in this conversation and other conversations, the element of fantasy is profound in the area of technology,
Absolutely.
and not only amongst people who are not familiar with how the nuts and bolts work, but even within the field, and it powers terrible outcomes, and allows people to blind themselves to impacts, actually, because they believe that they are moving in a positive direction
Right.
and that they're doing God's work, because they have these fantasy blinders on.
Right.
And some people are actually just sinister, but that's fairly rare. I mean, I think most
Right.
people are actually of relatively goodwill. And so piercing the fantasy, I think, is key, in addition to to
Right. We need
understanding
the
how.
we need the ideology critique glasses, sunglasses from They Live.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes.
So that we need to also
I,
talk about like some of our favorite films like Akira and
oh,
Ghost in the
absolutely, man.
Shell,
Yeah, that no, that'd be an
because they're
awesome
relevant to this
conversation.
conversation too
Yeah.
as futuristic films, right?
Yeah, yeah, because they shape our vision, a vision of the future. I remember, and I'll just tell this briefly, and then we'll close it out. I remember the first time I saw Blade Runner, and
Oh
I
yeah.
saw it, and I saw it when it was first released, right?
Wow.
And I went to a theater by myself because my
This was in
friends
Philly
were. It was
or
in Philly, and
okay.
my friends were my friends were all busy, and they said, "Oh, can you wait till you know how it was? All your boys get together, and you're like, well, let's go see the some science fiction movie." And for some reason, everybody was busy. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to go. And then I'll go again, if I like it. And it was like a Thursday night. It was rainy, which was perfect. Right.
Wow.
And so I go into the theater.
Wow.
Right. It was perfect. Right.
That is
And it's in
perfect.
this old theater, which is no
And
longer
it's
there
like
because,
leaking water and
yeah, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't like the final scene with
okay.
Roy, but it was a theater that was built in the 1920s, and
Mm,
so it had like the
it's
stage and
quaint.
everything.
Yeah.
Now, of course, everything shiny and new, but back then,
Was
so
it was it full? Were there a lot of
it was
people?
pretty full, yeah. But it was
Wow.
pretty full, and back then, what you had were more readers who would then
Mm,
it was like a Philip K. Dick audience, which was also fantastic, right?
right. Do androids dream of electric sheep,
Yes,
right?
exactly. Yeah. And so the movie starts, and it starts, of course, with that fantastic sequence
Vangelis.
of Vangelis, and then of the burn off towers from the oil rig from the oil refineries. Which you're thinking, oh, they still have oil refineries? What's that all about? Yeah, but how intelligent to know that oil would still
Do
be
you
back
remember
there.
when they juxtaposed recently the California fires to that scene and it looked exactly the same?
No, really?
Oh yeah.
No, I did not
And
see
by the
that.
way, the year in the future was 2019, right before the
Yeah,
pandemic, and I did
yeah.
a screening on the exact date.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I love this film. I've seen it so many times. It's
It's
one
a
of the best films of
fantastic
all time.
movie, and I just remember, the impact it had on me, right? Because this was the first time I watched a science fiction movie that depicted a world that had all the technologies that I dreamed of, but depicted them in a decayed state.
Yeah,
And that was like an eye opener for me. I was like, wow, you could
right.
accomplish certain technical things, but still be in a completely fucked up world.
Yeah.
And as a youngster, that never occurred to me, right? It
Yeah,
was
we can
just
bring
like
in
Star Trek.
Matt Flisfetter if we want to talk about it because he wrote an excellent book about it.
Oh, that'd be
Yeah,
fantastic.
yeah.
So anyway, yes, we could talk about that. We'll
It's
talk about movies
beautiful. It's so depressing and beautiful.
at the same time. Yeah,
Yeah,
which and also the fact that Ridley Scott understood that, like he made it to be depressing and beautiful.
right. And
You
Harrison
know,
Ford hated it. You know that story?
I do, and you know what? In that movie, I think of Harrison Ford in Blade Runner the way I think of Jimmy Stewart in Vertigo.
Right,
There were actors who didn't understand
right. The
what they were
significance, yeah.
participating in.
Because he
You know,
came from like Star Wars, so like, and that was like a blockbuster, and that came
yeah,
out before.
yeah.
And there's the whole another, and I guess we can save this for next time, like the whole relation between this and Alejandro Jodorowsky too,
Mm,
because
mm,
he was working on Dune for like 5 years, and the film wasn't realized, but a lot of his team members ended up working on Alien and Blade Runner,
yes,
Star
yes,
Wars, a lot
yes,
of iconic films from that time.
yes.
So it's interesting also the film that wasn't made, the influence of that
The
on
influence
these
of
other,
that, yeah,
yeah, on these
yeah,
other
yeah.
films.
So anyway, Robert, thank you so much
Well, thank
for
you.
your time, and we'll get together again, and we'll
Sure,
talk about movies and psychoanalysis and whatever else strikes our fancy.
absolutely. I'm down for it.
All right, brother.
Thank you.